All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is on how to start backyard composting. So today we're going to be talking about the basics of how to successfully start up a backyard compost system that works well for you. We are joined by Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District's Outreach Specialist, Corey Gassaway. My name is Amy Dunsmore. I'm SWACO's Education Specialist. And we are going to get started. Just real quick, a couple housekeeping tips for those who are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform. So there is this orange arrow that I want to call to your attention. If you click on that orange arrow, it is going to expand a list of options. So the control panel will disappear throughout this session. So just click on that orange arrow to expand it so you can see all of the options within it. And so the major one that is going to be useful to our participants today is the questions and chat feature. So if you have a question today, I encourage you to type it in the questions and chat box at any point in time during the session. Everyone is on mute throughout the duration just to help eliminate background noise, but we will be answering everybody's questions throughout the presentation, as well as finding time at the end to go over questions and answers. So type that in whenever it comes to mind. There is also a couple handouts from today's webinar. So if you see the handout section, there's two PDFs that you can download. One is the slides from today's webinar if you're interested in holding onto those for your records or sharing those with a friend or family member. The other one is the Community Backyard Rebate Programs informational handouts. So feel free to double click on those, download them. If you happen to forget to download them during today's session, no worries, you can always email me afterwards. My email is in your registration email that you received, and I'll be happy to send those your way after today's session. And also, just as a friendly reminder, if you do have to jump off the call early today, we understand people are busy. This session will be recorded and it will be sent to you tomorrow afternoon. So before we dive into the content of today's educational session, I did want to briefly talk about SWACO and who we are as an organization. So SWACO manages the waste stream for Central Ohio, and we strive to make our region a leader in environmental sustainability by offering a range of services and programming related to recycling household materials, recycling household hazardous waste, and helping prevent illegal dumping and littering. We also offer grants to communities, nonprofits, and schools to help them reduce the amount of waste that they generate. And we offer public recycling drop-off locations all around Franklin County. That's just a quick snapshot of some of the services that are provided to Franklin County residents. I encourage you to check out swaco.org to learn more about the diversion services SWACO provides. So why is all of this so important? Well, let me tell you a little story about the Franklin County waste stream. So as a community, residents and businesses alike, we are creating more waste every single year. Over the past several years, Central Ohio has been experiencing population growth and a booming economy. As more people move to our community, more of that waste ends up in our local landfill. From a recent waste characterization study, which is basically a fancy word for a waste audit, we found out that we're throwing materials away that don't actually belong in the landfill. They could have been recovered through recycling or composting instead. In fact, 76% of the materials that make their way to the Franklin County sanitary landfill could have been recovered through recycling or composting. So this is going to be materials such as cardboard boxes, aluminum cans, food scraps, and then other recoverable items like furniture and clothing. You may even be surprised to see that food waste is the #1 contributor at 15% of the total waste stream. We have an amazing opportunity to increase recovery of these materials through increased access and education. Even though more waste is making its way to the landfill, our rates of recycling and composting, are increasing yearly. And the even better news is that we're diverting more and more material through reuse and recycling and composting each year. In 2020, we maintained a 50% diversion rate for 2 consecutive years in a row. So that means that 50% of all the materials that we generate as a community are being diverted through recycling and composting. That's pretty impressive considering the national average is right around 34%. So as opposed to sending organic material to the landfill, organic waste can be returned to the environment in a beneficial way through composting. Properly disposing of organic waste, such as food scraps and yard waste, has several benefits. We're just going to quickly highlight those. First off, it saves landfill space. The less space we have to designate for landfills, the more land we have to use for other resources. Number 2, it saves money on landfill tipping fees. It does cost to dispose of waste at the Franklin County Sanitary Landfill, and you can help save your community money by not putting organic materials in your trash can. Number 3, it improves soil quality. Corey is going to talk to us more about that here shortly. Compost improves water retention, soil structure, and the ability for soil to store nutrients. And number 4, the one that many of you are probably thinking about right now, it reduces the amount of greenhouse gases generated. So, quick science lesson. A byproduct from the decomposition of organic materials is landfill gas. This is comprised of carbon dioxide and methane gas, both of which are powerful greenhouse gases. Even though SWACO does have a gas management system in place to help mitigate the amount of methane gas that's released into the atmosphere, it's still better for the planet to turn those organic materials into compost or mulch, something that can be returned to the earth as a soil additive. This truly does speak to turning waste into a resource for our community. So let's start off with some basics before we delve into how to start backyard composting. Many of you are probably already composting today and you didn't even realize it. So you're already participating in the act of composting by bagging your yard waste material and putting it out for curbside pickup. So our waste here in Franklin County will go on to become mulch or rich compost. Over 90% of communities in Franklin County have access to curbside yard waste programs, making it really easy and convenient for residents to make the right choice when it comes to the environment. If you have excess yard waste, say you're cutting down a tree, you're doing some serious landscaping in your yard that just won't cut it to put it out for the curb, you can always take your yard waste to one of the many yard waste facility drop-off spots throughout Franklin County, and we'll go over those here in a few minutes. So the proper way to set up to prep our materials for curbside collection for yard waste is put it in a paper biodegradable bag. So there's a picture of one on the screen there. You can get these bags at Giant Eagle, Kroger, hardware stores, and if you don't want to purchase the biodegradable bags, you can also designate a container and clearly mark it with yard waste on it. So for example, at my household, I converted an old cracked trash can into a yard waste can, and then just wrote, yard waste in it in spray paint, and that's what I put my yard waste in every year. I save money on not buying paper bags, and then I get to reuse that trash can every week. If you're not interested, if you don't really want to put it in a container, you're more interested in bundling it, you can bundle your branches with string. You want to try to keep them in 3 feet by 2 feet bundles. And any containers or bundles shouldn't be larger than 50 pounds because some people have to manually pick that up depending on what community you live in, and we don't want it to be too heavy for the workers. And then you're really trying to keep only organic materials in this stream. So if you think about when we buy compost and we buy mulch, we don't see other bits of plastic and materials in our mulch. So we want to try to keep it free from plastic bags, plastic nursery pots, plant labels, and then our program here for yard waste does not accept food scraps either. So if you've been putting your food scraps in your yard waste containers, please stop doing that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what you can do with your food scraps. And if you aren't going to remember everything I just said, you can also print off or go to this website to download, go to sprinkle.org to download this graphic and then post it somewhere in your garage as a helpful reminder. This is the do's and don'ts for curbside collection here in Franklin County. Really, the big rule of thumb is you can ask yourself, did this material grow in my yard? Was it alive at one point in time? If it was alive, then you can place it in your yard waste bin. And I'm thinking ahead to my favorite time of year, fall, when we have leaves falling from the trees. And we put those leaves, and every community has a different way for picking them up. They could come by in the front yard, pick them up with a truck, or maybe you put them in your bags and you put them out for curbside collection. If you're interested in starting to compost, then a pro tip that I've learned over the years as a backyard composter is to save my leaves. So instead of giving those leaves to the service department, maybe you should store and bundle them, keep them in storage for the winter, and that will be your carbon source for your compost bin. So that is my pro tip to you, and Corey's going to tell us more about that here shortly. So if you do end up having overflow of yard waste, it's not going to all fit in your curbside. You don't have enough paper bags, you don't have enough yard waste collection cans. Take it to one of these drop-off locations. So we have Kurtz Brothers, Ohio Mulch, and Comtil. Each one of these retailers has a different business model, and therefore they have different restrictions on the types and sizes of materials they do accept. So I would encourage everyone to check their websites to confirm that your material that you're looking to divert and compost will meet the criteria that they are looking for. So I'm just going to quickly pause here to see if there's any questions about yard waste and prepping our materials for collection. So Karen asked a question about cardboard. If using cardboard, will this draw slugs? Corey, do you have any thoughts on that? If you're using cardboard, will this draw slugs? I'm not sure exactly what she's referencing.
Maybe there's like a cardboard composting method you can use to kill turf grass. And if it is in a moist or shady area, you could get some slugs kind of hanging out underneath the cardboard if it's on the ground. But I shouldn't think that would cause any problems in that situation. Okay. And yeah, once you take that cardboard up and it's not dark and moist under there anymore, your slugs aren't going to want to be hanging out.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Karen, let us know if that addressed your question or if we should expand on that a little bit further. All right, so I think that's all I have for now for questions that are coming in. So what about composting food scraps? So as I mentioned before, our yard waste program does not have the capacity here in Franklin County to accept food scraps and process them. So we do need to manage our food scraps in a different way. There are several options here in Columbus for managing your food scraps, and we're going to help you figure out what the best method is for your household. So now I'll turn it over to Corey to tell us a little bit more about how you can start composting in the home and how you can sign up to become eligible for a $50 rebate towards the cost of purchasing a compost system.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I'm Corey Gassaway. I'm the Outreach Program Specialist, as Amy mentioned, at Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District. Our office is mainly concerned with the conservation of, if you could guess, soil and water resources within Franklin County. So each county in Ohio has a soil and water conservation district that sort of looks out for those resources and provides resources to the residents of the county on learning more. So if you ever have a question about soil and water, please reach out to our office. If we can't help you, we probably know someone who does. But a program I'm talking about today is the Community Backyards program. So if you are thinking of purchasing a compost bin once this program is over, you're really inspired. Our program lets you get a $50 rebate on that bin. And we'll talk, there are a couple restrictions. We'll talk a little bit about those, but just keep that in mind as we're talking today, if that's something you think you're gonna plan on doing. So Amy talked about how compost is good for diverting our food waste, and we like compost in our office because it helps improve water and soil quality, and it does that by helping to reduce stormwater runoff. So why do we want to reduce stormwater runoff? Every single time it rains, the raindrops fall onto hard surfaces like our roofs, our driveways, the streets, and once the water runs down these hard surfaces, picking up everything in its path, so you can see here on this graphic, picks up some bacteria from the dog poop, maybe some salt left over after you salted your sidewalk. If your car has a leak, that water's picking those fluids up too and sending them all down this storm drain. And some people think that the storm drain leads to a water treatment facility or has some sort of filter in it that can keep those things from going into our water supply, but they do not. So they're just plain old pipes underneath the roads that end up in our rivers and streams where there's habitat, right? So there's wildlife, there's fish, and our drinking water comes from there. In Columbus, our drinking water, a lot of it comes from the Scioto River, and that's where our storm drains will outlet if you're in the Scioto watershed. So you can see kind of the list: pet waste, leaves, fertilizers, motor oil, all these things become pollutants once they leave our backyards or our houses and get into our waterways. All right, so a little bit of trivia, and I think we have a poll here for you guys to take. So healthy soil serves as a filter and sponge for stormwater. When added to soil, what percentage of pollutants do you think compost can filter out? So we're adding our finished compost to our soil. What percentage of pollutants washing down can that compost capture? Give everyone a little time to pick an answer.
All right, it looks like we have just about everybody in. And so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Perfect.
And then it looks like the 50% of people selected 44%. So 44% of what was added to the soil can be filtered out. Is that right, Corey?
It is actually 60 to 95%. So it's a lot of pollutants. Like this graphic says, it's astounding. And those pollutants are things like bacteria, heavy metals, so all kinds of nasty stuff that our compost can soak up. Now, why can it do that? So compost acts like a sponge. And this is something you can really see if you're out in like a really nice park in the forest. And you take a look at the soil there, you're going to see it's really spongy, and that's because it's made up of lots of decomposed leaves and organic matter. And this nice spongy texture allows compost to absorb water and hold it there, which is great if you have a garden, especially for a time like now where things start to get a little dry. That compost can hold on to water. It also contains nitrogen, which is the main nutrient that plants need to grow. So if you're using Miracle-Gro fertilizer, that's nitrogen. You could get the same thing out of making compost. And it also increases microbial activity, which normally we think of microbes as maybe not so good things, but in the soil, they're great. So they can live with the roots of plants and help plants grow. They can get air into the soil, which helps plants a lot, and they provide food for the little bugs and things that live in the soil and help deposit nutrients in the soil as well. So it's really a win-win-win that compost is a sponge and can hold 5 times its weight in water and all those pollutants, like we said. So kind of tying this back into what we were saying about stormwater runoff, you can see here that our situation in an urban environment when it rains is a little different than what happens out in a park or in a natural environment. And the main difference here is infiltration. So that's a big word. It's just talking about how the water can get into the ground. So if water falls on your lawn, let's say, a majority of the water is going to be soaked into the ground. That doesn't happen when we have buildings and lots of paved hard surfaces. What happens instead of infiltration is runoff, which again leads to pollutants. It can also cause flooding problems. So if we can get more like this natural environment on the left, we can reduce pollution and reduce flooding, which is our goal. And composting is going to help us do that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to compost. We're going to use food scraps and things like yard waste and shredded paper. We'll talk a little more in detail. We're going to give those things about 6 to 8 weeks. That's a good summertime estimate for it to turn into compost. Once we have our compost, we can put it in our gardens. You can grow vegetables, fruit, plants. You can even put it around your trees or even add it straight to your lawn. Yeah. So yeah, about 6 to 8 weeks. We're gonna break down the things we put into our compost system into 2 different groups. So it's pretty simple. The first one is browns. So this is your kind of bulky, tough, fibrous stuff that contains a lot of carbon. So things like shredded paper, dried leaves, really finely ground wood chips, even some old weathered straw. These make really good browns. And the other types of items we can stick in there are our greens. So this is most of your food waste is going to end up being greens, coffee grounds, and fresh cut grass clippings are all what we'll refer to as greens. Our next slide will go into a little more detail about the amounts of those items. So generally, and you have a little bit of wiggle room here, but we want our compost pile to be 30% greens and 70% browns. So a lot more of those carbon materials than our green stuff, which ends up working out for us because normally we're going to have a lot more yard waste than we do food scraps in our homes. A couple things you do want to avoid: yard waste contaminated with chemicals. So if you just spread your lawn or spread some fertilizer or pesticides on your lawn, you don't want to be sticking those right into your compost. Any plants with diseases or poisonous plants like poison ivy or invasive plants, so things like honeysuckle or garlic mustard, we don't want to be sticking those in our compost because they are very vigorous plants that can sometimes keep on just growing in the compost and spreading. Weeds with seeds, we don't want to put seeds of any sort into our compost pile. Even things like avocado pits and peach pits will sometimes germinate in there. So definitely no weeds with seeds. No meat, fish, grease, or dairy. Those things get really yucky. They can get bacteria on them that is not good for our health. So some disease-causing bacteria, and then some nasty things like lots of flies and maggots. So just really kind of throws off the balance of a home compost pile. No cat or dog waste or kitty litter either. Again, some nasty bacteria in there that we don't want to be growing cultures of in our backyard. And then plastics, glass, and metal. Kind of obvious, those are things that don't break down at all. But also in here is bioplastics. So There are a lot of plastic bags coming out, especially in the last few years, that say they are biodegradable, but often they still take a really long time, like a decade or more, to break down, which might work in a big commercial compost facility, but in our backyards, we don't have that kind of time. Best to just throw those in the trash or recycle them. So we got our 70% browns and our 30% greens in here. Now what are some things we need to look at? So one thing that can help you kind of understand your compost pile a little bit is the temperature. So anywhere between 90 and 150 degrees is fine. So this isn't something you have to be out taking its temperature every single day. Generally, if it's kind of in this window, it's going to be good. But if you're having trouble with your compost, it can be helpful to see the temperature. They make really huge thermometers you can stick in there and see if that temperature is what's causing your problem. So over 150 degrees will kill beneficial bacteria. So you'll see your compost kind of slowing down if it's way too hot. And if it's too cold, that bacteria won't want to live in there either. So below 90 degrees or above 150, the best way to get it back into kind of that good 90 to 150 zone is to turn it or aerate it or add water to it. So both those things will generally help balance out your pile and help get the temperature back to what it needs to be. As far as size, about 1 cubic yard is ideal. And if you're buying a compost bin, usually they are about that size anyways. They kind of been sized out for you. Compost piles also need air. So I was talking about turning it. A shovel or a pitchfork usually works fine. You can also get a fancy aerator or a PVC pipe, like in this picture with holes in it. And you also want to make sure your compost pile stays moist, about as moist as a wrung out sponge. So not dripping wet, but not really dry either. Again, we're trying to foster these nice bacteria and microbes that are breaking down everything in our compost bin for us. So if you are participating in the Community Backyards program, we require you to have an enclosed compost bin. And that is mainly because of rodents, which we'll touch on a little bit. But any of these would be eligible for our program. So there's some on the ground. There's a Vermi composter there that I think Amy's going to talk about, but lots of different options. So kind of no matter what size space you have, there's probably a compost bin that will work for you. And rodent proofing a container, it's really easy. It just takes a little bit of hardware cloth if it's not already enclosed on the bottom. And that will keep mice and rats from burrowing into there. We're going to avoid things like meats, oils, and grease. Again, not just because they have diseases, but because rodents really like those things. If you do have some really stinky stuff in your pile, you can layer some dead leaves or some browns over it. That helps make it less attractive to animals. Keep it kind of away from your home. And again, yeah, that hardware cloth on the bottom or any open part of a compost bin is a really nice, easy way to keep the things we don't want out of there. If you're not participating in the program and you want to do kind of a DIY option, we really like these pallet designs, but obviously there's all types of ways you can make a compost pile, right? As you can see, most of these are about a cubic yard, and some of them have multiple piles inside of them. So kind of as things decompose, you can move them around and make space for new stuff. So some cool ideas there. And yeah, you can get really fancy and go stone or concrete. Concrete blocks even can work just fine. Or yeah, the one in the middle looks like more of like a masonry project, if that's your thing. And lastly, just open space or just building a nice little chicken wire kind of cylinder and sticking your leaves and grass clippings in there. even if your compost is mostly leaf matter, you can see on the top left, that can decompose into really nice, what a lot of gardeners will call black gold. It's just a really nice compost material that provides a lot of nutrients for your plants. So definitely a spectrum of types of composting, from doing it in a bin, where it's more of a science, to just kind of leaving things in a pile and letting nature take its course.
Thanks,
All right.
So that was all really helpful, and lots of options out there depending on how much organic material you generate in your house. Also depending on the type of space you have. Maybe you have a large backyard, you're looking to do multiple different systems, a pile and some tumblers. Perhaps you live in an apartment complex, or you live by yourself and you really just don't generate that much material, but you still are interested in diverting your food scraps. So what I can tell you is the act of composting with worms might be something you're interested in exploring. So this is called Vermi Composting, and this is the act of composting with our friend, the red wiggler worm. So this is going to be great for people who live in a small unit, small apartment, and don't generate a ton of organic materials. And this is also a huge hit with kids. So if you have little ones around and they like playing outside and getting in the dirt, and they're interested in critters and insects, I highly encourage you to explore vermi composting. So real quick, you want to start with 1 pound of red wiggler worms. These can be purchased at City Folk Farm Shop in Clintonville. You want to stay local. You can also order them online. Your 1 pound of red wigglers is about 1,000 worms, and 1,000 worms can eat about 3.5 pounds of food scraps per week. So think about that as you determine the types of systems that would work best for you. If you create more than 3.5 pounds of food scraps a week, this may not be the ideal system that you want to implement. So similar to some humans, worms aren't really big fans of spicy foods or acidic foods. So citrus peels and other spicy foods you want to avoid putting in the bin. But they can handle all sorts of other types of food scraps and fruits and vegetable peelings. Just like Corey mentioned, we're always layering with, whenever we put food scraps in or nitrogen sources, we're layering with carbon. That carbon is really key to keep the odors down, as well as to deter any insects or fruit flies from visiting your bin. And so in the world of red wigglers, we call that bedding. Shredded paper works great for red wigglers. And so you want to, every time you put food scraps in, you want to make sure you put a nice healthy layer of bedding on top, so the food scraps are covered, and so they have ample, allows for proper ventilation, and then it also helps keep it dark and moist in their habitat because they do not like light. So they can be a bit picky when it comes to the moisture content of the bin. So similar to our compost systems outdoors, we want the content to be as moist as a wrung out sponge. So not dripping in water, but certainly there needs to be moisture present because they breathe through their skin. And so if you notice the bin sort of drying out, I would encourage you to get a spray bottle to moist down the shredded paper. That will really help the moisture content inside of the bin. And then you can use cardboard, shredded cardboard, you can use leaves, and you can use shredded newspaper or shredded paper from your shredder. It's always a good idea to make the food scraps and the paper sources, your carbon source or your bedding, a palatable size. So make it as small as you can. That's going to make it more approachable for the worm to eat and break down, and the faster your compost bin will break down and actually make those castings, which is just a fancy word for worm poop. And I tell you what, your soil, your flower beds, your garden really, really benefit from that natural fertilizer that the worms create. So you're going to be able to harvest this worm bin every 2 to 6 months, depending on the volume of material you place in the bin. So it really just varies. And the best method that from practice on my own with my worm bin is to place, when you're looking to harvest the castings, place all of the new materials. So when you go to add your new scraps, your new bedding, put that to one side of the bin. What's going to happen is all the worms are going to naturally migrate to that side of the compost bin to start enjoying the fresh materials you just added. And then what's the other half of the bin should be mostly empty, and you'll be able to harvest those castings and take those out to your garden. Now, you can then do a quick double check to make sure you're not losing any of those worms. You can also, the worms can go in the garden. They're a good source of nitrogen. They probably won't live forever, but because they do need regulated temperatures. They don't like really extreme temperatures. No, not really cold winters here in Ohio, and not hot summers here. But they will repopulate, so they'll come back on their own if you do end up losing a few through the transfer. And my biggest tip to people, if you are exploring vermi composting and you're worried about adding too much material at once and overwhelming the worms, because keep in mind, if you overwhelm the worms and they cannot eat the food fast enough, it will start to get moldy and maybe even have an odor. If you're adding more than 3.5 pounds per week, you can always freeze your scraps. So consider placing those in the freezer. They'll get really mushy by the time you pull them out for the worms, which they'll love that. It'll make it easier for them to digest and eat for you. And then that way you can kind of monitor the amount of food that you're placing in the bin each week. All right, so now we're gonna take a pause here real quick to start answering questions related to the backyard rebate program or general composting questions. So Corey, I had a great question come in. I think I know the answer to it, but I would love it to get your expert opinion too. How often do we need to replace compost in our garden or flower bed?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Once or twice a year would be my recommendation. If you are making a lot of compost and you're going to end up adding more, doing it more often is totally fine. But usually about as often as you would mulch would be as often as I would compost. Did you have different thoughts, Amy?
Yeah, I think that's in line with what I would say too. And I do say that I use it as topsoil in my lawn too, because I have 3 compost bins. I have a small garden, and I just have more compost than I can use in my garden. And so I just kind of use it as like kind of a natural fertilizer on my lawn. So I don't then have to add any chemicals, herbicides, pesticides. I try to stick with that. And then I also try to give away compost to my friends who have a bigger garden than myself. So if you have an excess compost and you don't have enough space to use yourself, give it to a friend or a neighbor. I'm sure they would appreciate that. Another question came in about the 30 to 70% balance. Corey, is that by weight or is that by volume?
Ooh, man, that's a really good question. I would say by volume. And again, it's not an exact science. I think the 30 to 70%, you can usually just eyeball it. You don't necessarily have to weigh it out and keep it exact. But that's just a good ratio to try and keep your pile at, just so things keep decomposing at a decent rate. If you have more browns, it'll still break down. It'll just go a little slower. If you have more greens, that can be a little more problematic. Kind of what Amy was talking about, things might kind of get moldy or might throw off the balance a little more. But yeah, 70% or more browns. But yeah, that 70-30 will just keep things moving for you better.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Corey. I would also say that over the years of troubleshooting different compost systems, a lot of experts say that equal ratios by weight. Now, it's kind of hard to decipher that. I mean, you're holding a pound of food scraps and then you're holding a pound of leaves. I mean, for me, I just try to think, you know, in terms of like double the volume, but I know some people also think about it in terms of weight. So if you are more, if you're more likely to think of it on that way, then I would try to do equal portions by weight. Great question, Christopher. William asked a question about my Miracle-Gro tumbler instruction says paper products are not good due to chemicals that may be in them. Is that true? Do you have any ideas, Corey?
Sometimes we'll run into that if it's like glossy paper or something like a magazine, but otherwise, the majority of dyes used in the United States for our paper products are safe to put into your compost pile. I don't think it used to be that way. I think there used to be maybe toxic dyes that were used in the printing process, but that's not something we've run into.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I've never had any issues with composting my shredded paper, but I will say that I do steer clear from heavily inked paper. So if I see that the paper is just overwhelming with like colored ink, I will then omit that from my bin. But if it's just a little bit of black text on the paper, I feel pretty good about putting that in my compost bin. So Erin asked a great question about your opinion, Corey. And so she's saying, in your opinion, what's the best enclosed compost bin for food scraps and yard waste that will continue composting all winter long? Is it tumblers or is it on the ground bins? They say that they have groundhogs in their yard, and so they're really concerned about attracting groundhogs with an open pile.
Gotcha. I personally love the on the ground ones a little more than the tumbler. Part of that is that you still have a connection between the soil and your compost bin. So a lot of those microorganisms can make their way up into the bin. With a tumbler, you might find yourself having to add like some of the soil from like your garden or something just to get those fungi and bacteria kind of kick-started on their job. If you have a groundhog, something easy you can do is get like some concrete pavers and put those on the bottom. That kind of gets rid of that soil connection. But there will still, if you keep some little cracks in there, as long as they're not groundhog sized, and use some of that hardware cloth, I think you could get a little creative there and make that work.
Great, thank you. William asked a question about his tumbler often gets these balls of materials inside of it. What is our recommendation for preventing those balls of materials? Do you?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, do you know what he's talking about at all?
No, I'm not sure. The only thing I can think of is maybe if it's too moist, maybe things kind of stick together in there, especially some of the like food type scraps.
I would agree with you, and I can say, William, from personal experience, I know this is anecdotal evidence, but sometimes that does happen in my tumbler and at my home. And so what I do if I get these kind of clumps of material is then I'll work to break them up. So I just take a little teeny hand shovel and kind of break them up, and then I add more carbon to the bin, because I think probably at that point there's too much moisture present inside. I'll do kind of the quick test where I pull out the materials, I squeeze them, and if I see excess water dripping out of my hand, then I know I have too much water present in my compost bin. And so I'll break up those pieces to further their decomposition process, and then I will add more carbon. And so I shred up the carbon as much as I can. That will also help. Everything that you can do to shred materials is going to accelerate your composting process. So you're going to have your compost finished much faster than if you put really big bulky pieces of cardboard or sticks in your compost system. So shred that material up as finely as you can, and that's going to help accelerate the process and help hopefully deter these kind of clumps or balls of materials that you're referencing. Larry asked a question about storing leaves for the fall and what is our best method for how we store the leaves. Corey, do you have any thoughts on that?
I am a big fan of just kind of the chicken wire tunnel. I have a couple coworkers who have done that, and they always bring in pictures kind of the middle of the pile that has that nice dark compost in it. It kind of allows more air, and I think is more conducive to being able to kind of like move stuff around in the pile as opposed to just having like a flat pile on the ground.
Yeah, so that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, but that's assuming we have ample space in our backyard to
Yes.
designate for a leaf pile, right? So for some of us who maybe have limited space, we live in the city, and we just don't have that room. I can say, as someone who lives in the city, that I just put my leaves in a brown paper bag, and I store them in the garage or on my back patio underneath the cover, so that way rain and stuff doesn't get underneath them. I know that can take up, you know, precious real estate if you live in a small home, but for me, I just put them out of the way in the garage, and they stay really well all winter long. I don't have any issues with smell or anything. What I will say is try not to mix the leaves in, try not to add grass clippings or anything else, weeds, in with your leaves, because that could be that could cause an odor, especially as spring nears and it starts to get warmer inside your garage. So, but I store a couple bags all winter long in my garage, just leaves, and I haven't had any issues. All right. Yeah, Michaela asked a great question about worm tea. I love this one. What, if anything, can I do with worm tea that comes from the worm composting? Can I reuse it somehow? You know, that is such a great thought. I do the same thing with my backyard tumbler. I create this compost tea, and you know, that is just a nutrient-rich fertilizer that your plants love. And so I always add that fertilizer to my plants when they start growing in the spring. I don't put them in right away when they're seedlings. I kind of wait until they're a little bit older. But you can absolutely add that compost tea to your garden if you have it, or give it to a friend who has a garden. Or if you have flowers, you know, you could even put them in your potted plants at home. I would just be very careful not to add too much, because you don't want to overwhelm or burn the plant with too much nitrogen. Great question.
I've diluted it with water in a watering can too.
There you go. That's great. Thank you. All right, I know we are coming in with a lot of questions here, and I want to continue on with the presentation. I'm going to take one more here. Joanne asked a great question about getting her compost bin back into balance. She said she knows that her tumbler bin has been too wet before in the past, and it started to look really moldy. Can I just add the browns, or should she start all over? What do you think?
That's a good question. I would probably say start by adding the browns, give it 2 or 3 months, and if you still have really bad mold problems, then maybe consider starting over. If you're seeing mold, I mean, the organisms that are mold, that fungus is part of what's helping break stuff down. You're obviously just have kind of an excess of mold or more than you want in your pile. So I would think adding browns, just trying to help dry that out a little bit that way, will probably help kind of trend your mold down a little bit.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, but a little bit of mold is okay. It's not going to be detrimental to the balance of the compost bin. And so it's okay if you see a little bit of mold. If the whole entire all the food scraps are covered in mold, that's a different problem. But whenever I've had mold in my bin, I just added more carbon, and it's worked itself out.
Yeah, and same goes with insects. So if there's bugs in your compost pile, there's supposed to be a few. They're part of the kind of work crew that's helping break that down. As long as you don't have a really bad infestation, bugs are totally fine in there.
Yes, very good. And then one last question real quick. So I think it's an interesting one, and it's not a one I've heard in the past in terms of troubleshooting. So Susan asked a question saying that the compost bin comes into contact with the ground directly, so it doesn't have a rodent screen or a base on the bottom, and it has ants living in there, which is fine. It's great to have those beneficial insects in there. But when she takes out the compost, the ants are biting her. Is there any way to keep them out?
Oh man, I have never tried to keep keep ants out of my compost bin before. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to research that. Can't really think of anything off the top of my head to help that other than trying to, I guess, remove as many ants as possible. But I don't know, they're social creatures, so it'd probably be hard to kick all of them out.
Yes, I would think so too. And you don't want to put any sort of chemicals because that's your compost and that's going to be going on your food sources or your plants. So that is a tough one. I will have to say, Susan, we'll need to do some research and get back to you. Good question though. That's why we love hosting these sorts of conversations, because we learn so much from our participants as well. So keep your questions coming in. If you do have more, we are going to move on real quick. So I just want to also mention some other food waste diversion opportunities for those who live in one of these communities listed on the screen. So we do understand that not everyone has the time, the energy, nor the space to compost all of the organic materials that they might generate in their house. And so we really are at SWACO striving to make composting as easy and convenient for Franklin County residents as we possibly can. And so many of Central Ohio's communities have implemented a food waste drop-off program. And so this is sponsored by and paid for through the SWACO's Community Waste Reduction Grant, which is actually in cycle and open right now to all nonprofits, government entities, schools, communities. If you are interested in applying for a grant, I encourage you to reach out to our grants administrator at SWACO. That's, as I said, the cycle is active right now, and it will be until August. What's the date here? August 6th at 5 p.m. And so because of this community waste reduction grant, many of these communities listed here, Dublin, Hilliard, Grove City, Upper Arlington, Westerville, Worthington, Grandview Heights, and the city of Bexley were all able to implement a community-wide food waste drop-off program. So if you live in one of these communities, I encourage you to reach out to your local service department to see how you can get involved and sign up. And then if you don't live in a community that offers a community drop-off location, you can also subscribe to a service that will be able to handle all the food scraps generated from your house or your business. So this even includes meat and dairy products, which we talked about do not belong in our backyard compost bin because they can attract rodents and other critters that you don't want cohabitating with in your backyard. And so some people even go as far as to backyard their fruits and vegetable scraps in their backyard bin, and then to put any leftover bones, dairy products, processed foods that they wouldn't want to place in their backyard system, they take to a commercial service provider. So we have 4 companies that service Franklin County. We have Go Zero, Compost Exchange, Innovative Organics, and Kids That Compost. I will say that each one of these companies has a different business model, and so I would encourage you to check to see if you're eligible for their service. And most of them also have a price that's attached with them, and it's varying costs too. So just reach out to these companies to learn more and see if you can get involved to start composting your food scraps. And then in summary today, we know that we spent a lot of time talking about composting, diverting our food scraps from the landfill. But food waste reduction and prevention is even more important, okay? And so reducing the amount of food that we waste by buying the food that we can eat and eating the food that we buy instead of landfilling it. When we landfill our food scraps, we lose the natural resources, the money, and the opportunity to feed hungry members of our community. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about food reduction tips and tricks, I encourage you to check out SaveMoreThanFood.org. This is an awareness campaign that's really focused on providing resources to help you prevent, reduce, and recycle the food waste that's generated at home, school, and your businesses. With nearly 1 million pounds, that's correct, 1 million pounds of food waste enters the Franklin County Sanitary Landfill every single day. It's more important than ever to do our part to reduce food waste in our community. I want to thank everyone for their attention today. I'm going to start taking any final questions that people have before we wrap up here in a few minutes. Linda asked a great question about adding dryer lint and vacuum dust. Should we add those types of materials to our compost bin? Corey, what do you think?
No, especially dryer lint. If you're using fabric softener or dryer sheets, a lot of those chemicals can be toxic to the microbes that we need to help break things down. Same with vacuuming. I guess it depends on what you're vacuuming, but if you're doing a carpet that has been shampooed or you have used some sort of stain remover on, those microbes are really sensitive, and any sort of chemicals in there can really throw them off and slow your compost down a lot.
Great, thank you. One more question from Paula. Can I apply shredded paper around my plants and wet it down to act as a mulch? Any thoughts, Corey?
If you have enough shredded paper, I don't see why not. It won't be the nicest looking thing, but I know we recommend that people put cardboard down when they're trying to kill turf grass and compost in layers over that, and that all breaks down. So I would think shredded paper, if you gave it a couple months, would break down the same way.
Yes, I would think so too. That's a great recommendation. And then Linda just said, she just clarified and said no dryer softener sheets are used, and then only hardwood floors. I'm not sure what the hardwood floors has to do with it. Oh, vacuum dust from the carpet, that's right. So only hardwood floors and then no dryer sheets used. So good question. Everyone, I want to thank you for your time today. There were some really, truly wonderful thoughts that came in, comments, good troubleshooting questions that came in too. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the backyard, the Community Backyard Program, I encourage you to check out Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District website. They have a whole page dedicated to the Community Backyard Program. You can take a quiz online. You can also participate, I believe, Corey, in an upcoming class. When is that? When's the next upcoming class?
Yeah, the next one will be June 12th. So it's a Saturday at 10. And then we'll have 3 more after that, kind of 1 per month on different days and times. So those run about an hour and a half and get really in depth about composting, native planting, and rain barrel installation as well. And the online course will probably take you 10 to 15 minutes. So depending on how much time you have and how much you want to take away from the program, there's those 2 options for you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Corey, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope everyone has a safe holiday weekend, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.